Welcome to the Changing the Perception of Sales podcast. And today I'm very pleased to say we are joined by Tony Morris. Tony, thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
It's great to have you here. And as we always like to start, just for the listeners and people tuning in, please give a little bit of an introduction into who you are and what it is that you do.
So who am I? I'm a guy that has a family. It's probably the most important thing to me. Born and bred in Hertfordshire, North London. I got into sales probably at the age of 14, where I sold sweets at my school, St Albans. And then I guess sales was something I was just naturally good at, but I started to learn to hone my craft. So yeah, I guess what do? I help people sell. That's what I do.
Help people sell, which is very relevant for some of the topics that we will be talking about today. Selling sweets in school as well is how a lot of people's sales journey start. What was your top selling sweet or confectionery back in the day, Tony?
Oh, what was my top sweet? I've always loved double deckers.
So
Always.
good.
And so good. And I still like them now. So my taste buds haven't really developed from the age of 13, I guess. Yeah, I've always loved a double decker.
Yeah, they're great. It's not when people put them in the fridge because they go really hard, but as they are, absolutely incredible.
Game
And
changer.
that was your obviously first experience and exposure to sales. We like to start on the podcast kind of at the beginning of your career in terms of your first introduction into, I guess, professional sales role. So just for the listeners, but where did it all start for you?
I think thinking back, I mean, really, it was selling sweets, but it wasn't a profession. But I realised I was quite good at persuading. I then did car washing with a good friend of mine, Mark Braid, at the time. I must have been 15. And again, I was just good at persuading to the outcome I wanted. I just didn't realize that was selling. So I guess my first proper sales job, I sold encyclopedias in Australia for a few months, which was door to door. But when I got back from traveling, like my first job was in a call center called Sitel, and I was selling gas and electric. And very quickly, I became the top salesperson out of about 120 people. And I started to understand, I guess, what I did a bit differently to other people. And I loved it. I just got a real appetite for it, that I was, I guess, more successful than others. And I started to understand a bit why, I guess.
Okay. And to go straight into that point then, you started to understand what it was you did differently to others. What were at that time, I'm sure it's changed, 20 odd years on, but at that time, what were the things that you were doing differently to the other 119 people in the team?
Yeah, it's a good question. And you know what? You said, I'm sure it's changed. Bits have definitely changed, but some of the things I did are still true of today. One is I wouldn't quit. I was not, I was so tenacious that I wasn't going to let anyone off the phone without at least getting at least 10 notes. So I think that was the first thing. The second thing, I was confident, but without being arrogant. There is a fine line, but I was so confident because I thought, you know what? I know I'm good without sounding arrogant. I knew I had an ability, and I looked at it as a bit of a game. For me, if they said no, then they're winning. So if I could get a yes out of them, I'm winning. And I enjoyed that game. I enjoyed that challenge. And I guess the other thing is I've always been a good questioner, always. And my dad used to say, my late dad said, Tony, you ask the best questions, but you don't listen. And we know in sales, the number one key is listening. So it's been my biggest weakness, but it's something I've really focused on. So I think when I develop my questioning, my listening, my confidence, my tenacity, that's what made me the top salesperson.
Brilliant. It's interesting you mentioned about gamifying because it's something we're hearing quite a lot at the moment. And I
Mm.
can see why, because whenever something is a game or a competition, it instantly becomes more fun and more
Yeah,
enjoyable, which
yeah,
certainly helps in what can be a difficult job. And
absolutely.
to kind of go through some of the things you mentioned, you obviously started selling sweets at kind of 14, then car washes as well. You mentioned that you've kind of always been tenacious and had that never say die
Mm,
attitude. Where do you
mm.
think that's come from?
Look, it's interesting, right? It's nature nurture. My mum wasn't very competitive. My dad wasn't very competitive, but he did play sports like tennis, and he wanted to win. But I guess it wasn't like he wouldn't be to the point of trying to beat me every time. There was fun competition, but fun as opposed to like um, challenging, if you know what I mean. But I guess it was advice my dad gave me, and my dad gave me some amazing advice, which is ultimately never quit. You know that it was something that was in, he said it regularly. He said there was actually a line he used. I can't remember exactly, but it was something like um, there were three. I'll have to come back to the exact line. It will come to me, but ultimately the message was don't quit. Yeah, that was the key message. But I'll come to the line. It will come to me. But I think that he spoke about it a lot, and it did. Although I don't remember the exact words, it stuck with me. And it's something Vince Lombardi said: "Quitters never win, and winners never quit." And I think I remind myself of that when I'm having a tough day, week, month, or I want to try and get a sale over the line. I remind myself of what my dad said and what Vince Lombardi said.
Brilliant. And we'll come on to a little bit more shortly around the tough days and what keeps you going and what's kept you going personally. But to go back onto the journey then, so started selling gas and electric, top performing salesperson out of a team of 120. How did your sales career trajectory kind of go from there to get you to the point where you're at today?
Well, I think I remember telling my dad that I used to win the monthly awards, like this little trophy, right? And my dad, I was there for about 4 or 5 months. So my dad said, look, you're clearly good at selling. He said you could create a career in the call center, but it's going to be, it's although it's probably a safe place to earn, it's B2C typically. So he said B2B is probably where you're going to earn more money and have a solid career. So he always said, look, IT is something that's never going to change in terms of, technologies change. But he said IT software is always going to be around. It's going to develop. And with AI, we're already seeing that development, right? That evolution. But he said, get into IT software sales, which I did. And I got my first job within 3 days selling software, and I loved it. And I was really good at it. I did it for 5 years. I became their top sales guy. And then I realized I was never going to be the sales director. I was 25. The director had been there for 10 years. That was never going to happen unless he got fired, which didn't look like something that was happening. So I left and then I set my company up 2006. And that's where I guess my career has blossomed since that moment 18 years ago.
What was it that made you make that move? Because a lot of people working in a sales role might feel the same feelings you had, lack of
Mm.
progression, not sure what the future looks like. So they may just choose to go and get another job, go into another position where, there maybe isn't that in place. What was it that made you go, actually, I'm going to go and set my own thing up?
You know what? I was very lucky actually, and it is luck. I think they say the harder you work, the luckier you get, right, Gary Player? But it was luck to the point that I met my gorgeous wife Shanna. But when I met her with boyfriend and girlfriend, her father Boyd, who's now my father-in-law, he was always good at selling, direct sales, and he also was good at training in call centers. And he used to hear me cold call and said, I impressed him as a cold caller. So it was his idea to set up a sales training company, and it was never on my radar ever. And he approached me. I remember it was about February, March 2006. We're in his garden having a beer, and he said to me, "Tony, I've always wanted to run my own business." He said, "You're the best cold caller I've ever met," and he said he's a good trainer. Why don't we set up a telesales training company? And it was like, you know what? I've got nothing to lose. We spoke to my dad about it, who unfortunately was very ill at the time. And my dad said, yeah, this is a good opportunity. But we'd had some money, about 100 grand, that he could put in to start a business, which is always the toughest part, right? I didn't have that liquid available. He did. Um, and that was sort of it. It wasn't something I was thinking about. I wasn't at that time. I think I was an entrepreneur from all the little things I did, but I wasn't you know, I was never going to be a Richard Branson at that time. But I think I've fallen in love with it. And I think I've become more entrepreneurial, more tenacious and hungrier than I've ever been, even from when I started in 2006 to where I am now.
Brilliant. And what a journey it's been. Certainly paid off
Mm.
given where you are now. Still doing 18 years on. And a big focus of the business that you run now is all around obviously improving sales performance, but a lot of it is focused specifically around the art of communication. So I want to tap
Yeah.
into and touch on a couple of those things. And one thing you mentioned earlier was around listening, which is so key in sales, and where, as you said yourself, was probably an area for development for you at the beginning of your career. How can
Massively.
people listening to this become better listeners?
You know what? It's such a hard thing to train and coach because you could just say, look, listen more, but that doesn't come naturally, right? So, I study NLP, and in NLP, they talk about the VAP model, that everyone has the three in them: visual, auditory, kinesthetic, touchy feely. But often people have a preferred communication style, being visual, auditory, kinesthetic. There was a study done by Kerry Johnson, who wrote a book called Selling with NLP, and he said from his research that 40% of the population are visual, 30 are auditory, and 30 are kinesthetic. Now I'm very visual, so when I understood that, I was like, my God, I'm probably 90% visual, right? But I knew, and I'm also kinesthetic. I'm quite tactile, but I knew auditory was my weakness. So I guess to answer your question, how did I develop it? One is, it sounds obvious, but I did focus more on listening, right? Simple as that. I really tried to hone my skills by listening more than I spoke. And I think that's the first point: is have great questions, because it forces the recipient to answer. And if the better the question, the more they're going to speak. And the more they speak, the more you can listen to learn. Most people listen to respond. The best salespeople in the world listen to learn. So that's the first point. The second point is, I've come up with this concept. I call it my opportunity antenna. Now, this is so hard to coach. And I guess part of it is, you've got to, how do I say it? I spot opportunities that other people don't spot. And it's things that are there, but they're not blatantly obvious. And I'll give you an example. I was doing door knocking with an estate agent, and we went into and I teach a concept called the mask approach with estate agents. We door knocked, and with a guy called Dan, he was the valuer, and we managed to get into this property from using my mask approach. We sat down, and cut a long story short, we won the instruction. They phoned the agent then and there to say we're leaving the contract, and they instructed us. But in the room was about 10 dogs. And I said to the owners, I said, yeah, I love dogs, but how come you got 10? And she laughed. She said, I run a doggy day business, babysitting for 20 years. And she said, I'm moving to Cornwall, which is why we're selling. They lived in a place called Ware. They're moving to Cornwall. And she said, and I'm gutted, but I'm going to stop dog sitting. And I said, 20 years, your customers are going to be devastated. They are. They really are. And that was it. We left, went for a coffee to give Dan feedback. And I said, Dan, you were amazing, but what did you miss? He couldn't get it. And I said, opportunity antenna. And what I said was, she's been looking after dogs for 20 years. Most people that put dogs into, dog sitters live locally. So think of all these customers she's got that are likely to live locally, that likely are to sell a house, buy a house, be a landlord, or be looking to rent. There's opportunities there that you're not tapping into. Now, for me, that was obvious, but for most people, it wouldn't be. So I guess the technique there is, ask yourself, in most situations, most sales situations, is there a bigger opportunity that I'm not spotting right now? And that doesn't mean you go for it, because it's selfish. If I said, oh, dogs, can you introduce me to all your customers? That's selfish. That's my priority, not theirs. But I'd make a note of it. So when I achieve their goal and sold their property so they can move to Cornwall, then I'd have asked. And that could have turned into stupid amounts of opportunity. So the key is, everyone's got an opportunity antenna. 99% of people is switched off. You've got to switch on your antenna.
Switch on that opportunity antenna, everyone. But I think it's an interesting point as well. And you mentioned they're really listening. It's easy to say listen more, but actually asking great questions and listening to learn rather than respond. We have
Mm,
it a lot with the people that we speak to, salespeople. They are too focused on thinking, what am I going to ask or what am I going to say next, rather than actually just listening to the words that are coming out of the other person's mouth.
There's 2 points there. So I've developed something called my 7 set questioning system, and one of them's tag on. So tag on is you say something, and I question it. You've been doing it in this interview really, really well because you've listened and you've tagged on to what I've said. So you have to listen to tag on. That's the first point. If you imagine the word listen, right, those 6 letters, if you could spell a different word using those 6 letters, any idea, Kyle, what that word would be?
I'm going to have to type it out so I can see it.
So
Listen.
think about listen, those 6 letters, spell a different word using all 6 letters. Hard, right?
I've got another word, but I don't think it's the one you're looking for.
Oh, what was your other word?
Enlist.
Oh, yeah, very good. I love that. Very good. So it's
Right.
not. Oh, I did this in December and someone said tinsel. I was like, I love that. But it's silent. Silent. So one of the best ways to listen is to not speak because no one likes silence. So if you're silent, you're forcing them to speak.
Love it. And it's something we talk about a lot as well, because you're absolutely right. If salespeople are afraid of silence, so what they often do,
Mm,
like you said, people don't like the silence. The salesperson, it's almost like a game of cat and mouse. Who's going to speak first?
mm.
Best thing you can do as a salesperson is just rein it in a little bit.
I'll be comfortable. Well, on that point, I think every sales conversation, every meeting should end with SAS. And SAS is summarize the call or the meeting. And you have to listen, summarize. So my suggestion is take some detailed notes, key points throughout the conversation. And the reason for that as well is when you do a proposal, you're using the prospect's language in the proposal, key words, key phrases. So summarize. Number 2 is action. What actions are you going to do? What actions are you asking them to do? And the final S is schedule. To schedule the next step. Very simple, but every conversation or meeting should end with an SAS. The first part's vital, and you can't summarize if you're not listened.
Great, love it. SAS. Definitely will be taking that on board. And you mentioned at the beginning when we started talking about listening, the different ways in which we communicate or prefer to communicate. And you talked about being visual. And it's no secret that behind you, there are certainly a lot of visual cues that we can see. We can't make out specifically what is on those whiteboards, but I'm just interested and curious myself. What have you got behind you, and how does that help you in your day to day?
Yeah, so I've done it already this morning, so it's a routine. So the red behind me is a monthly financial goal every month. So once I do a deal, I write it, whether it's existing client or prospective client, I put it in red because it's just, I like to see a temperature gauge of I've smashed my stretch target every month. So that just gives me a nice feeling. So that's what that is. Behind me is my today, my week, and my month. So the way I work out my time is I set myself minimum 3 goals a day, minimum. I don't believe in to-do lists. I call them will-do lists. So I won't leave today's office, and it might be 7 p.m., 8 p.m. until my will do is done. And then the things I want to do this week goes in the middle, the week, and obviously they'll move over to my will do, every day once I've done my will do list. And then my month is things that I've got planned for the month aren't priority. So once I've done all the stuff in my week, then I move some of the month stuff over to the week, and it's an evolving process to use my time more effectively. So that's what's behind me.
Love it. And why does that work for you? And the reason I ask this question, because particularly in today's sales teams and today's landscape, everything is digital, whether that be your dashboards, your to-do lists. I don't even use a notepad anymore, which I'm actually thinking of going the opposite way and going back to physically writing things down. And a lot of sales teams now might still have whiteboards in the office. A lot of them might not. So I guess for you, and this is probably more psychological, but why does it work physically, having it visually, but actually writing it down as well?
For me, it's because I'm visual. So I think if you're not a visual communicator, it probably won't work. But if you are, I think it's really important. So I've got things around me. That for me is just clarity of what I need to be doing and to be laser focused on what I need to be doing. So when I do my will do, it normally takes 5 to 7 minutes in the morning. because I look at my Trello board, which I use on my phone. I use Trello to manage again my list of stuff. Currently on my Trello, I've got like 71 things in my list, but obviously I can't do all 71. So I go through that very quickly. I colour them anyway. So red is urgent, yellow is warm, green is cold. But I go through that list and think, right, out those reds, which three will I do today? So that for me is my visual. But in front of me, I've got visuals in my office you can't see that says Happy Loony, E plus R equals O. And then I've got Happy Loony broken down in with a picture of my dad's boat on this board. And I finally have a picture of a little whale in front of me because I'm obsessed with this metaphor I use of whale. And I finally have this I love you, which was done by my gorgeous daughter. She put Happy Loony and she put I love you. And that's in front of me because she likes doing art for me and I think it's sweet. So it's a reminder of that and a reminder about the whale.
Well, I've got to ask about the whale. Tell us a little bit more around that and the meaning behind it.
So the whale came in 2007, I think, is when I understood the whale metaphor. And in a summary, it's a long story, but in a summary, I met a man called Ian McLean, who was a franchise director for Belvoir, which is a massive established franchise. I met him, talk about training. He said no. 6 months later, I met a guy called Eric Hall, who was the MD at the time of Northwood, who also said no for training. 6 months later, Eric called me and booked me for a speaking conference for Northwood, their first conference. In the audience, a guy called Dorian, who is the MD of Belvoir, now the MD of Property Franchise Group, their massive, biggest franchise in the country. They booked me. In the conference of Belvoir, a lady called Michelle Brooke booked me. Michelle's partner Liz, her husband, booked me, and it went on and on and on. That was about £2.1 million of business. Ian McLean, who said no to me in 2007, was my whale. I didn't spot it. So my whale is the biggest deal you'll ever do. And I land two whales every year, right? But I never know when I'm going to land a whale. And what's interesting for me is the reason I'm on it on every call is every call could be the whale. Often it's not the whale, it's who they're connected to is the whale. So Ian was connected. It's Eric Walker, by the way, not Eric Hall. I'm still in touch with Eric now. But Ian was my whale because of his connection, Eric's connection, and it went so on and so forth. So for me, I trace back every deal I've ever done, and there's always a way to trace it back to think, you know what, I've just landed this £2 million sale, all on the back of meeting that person 2 years ago. And for me, that's my driver that I'm always looking for the whale.
Love that. So, any salespeople listening to this, where is your next whale coming from? That's the question
Absolutely.
that I would ask. And whilst we're on this topic then of the visual things that you've just shared, actually, Happy Loony was something that you mentioned, and it would be no secret you've worked in a call center telesales environment, B2B sales, and having your own business for 18 years. I'm absolutely certain that not every day has been absolutely amazing, and it's probably been incredibly tough as well. So just share a little bit more for the listeners and people listening to this probably going, Happy Loony, what are these guys on about? What is Happy Loony and what does it mean to you?
So when I designed Happy Lunia, when it came to me, it wasn't at the time my why, but it now absolutely is. So my dad, bless him, he died at 55. He died in 2006. He just turned 55 in the February, and he died 31st July. He was only ill for about 10 months and passed. And I was very close to my dad. In my head, he was my hero. And obviously, he knew I was in sales. And my dad, I set my company up, as I mentioned, in May 2019. And I remember my dad passed 31st July 2006. So my dad saw that I set this company up. He was in the kitchen with me when I told him I landed my first deal, which was actually the first meeting I went on in Bournemouth. I met this loans company and I closed them for 3 days training. Dad was like, wow. My dad was aware when we landed our first, I guess, whale, a company called Cornhill. So my dad was aware of that. But obviously, then my dad passed, and 3 months later, got married. So in terms of losing a parent, it's never convenient, but it was in the worst time ever. It was, just after I set my company up, and 3 months before I got married. So it was two big things going on in my life, right? But I was lucky that my dad met my fiancée, now my wife, and my dad saw me set up a company. But my dad, in his last year, I guess one of his bucket lists was to buy a boat. He always loved boats, so my mum bought him a like a weekend of how learn to sail. And my dad bought a sailing boat, not massive, like a 30-foot sailing boat. And I went with him to London Excel to buy it. And my dad said to me on the car journey on the way home, I want to name it after you, me, and my sister Lucy. Can you think of a name? And I thought to myself, I'm a bit mad, I'm a bit loony. And I thought, that's perfect. My sister's Lucy, I'm Tony. Put them together, it's Loony. That was the name of my dad's boat. And then I thought, my kids are Harry and Poppy. Wish them together, it's Happy. So Happy Loony is, I guess, happy is my children, and that's my why with my darling wife. And Loony's about my sister and I and my dad. So put that together, it's all the things that I guess is most important to me in my life. And Happy Loony's now become, I guess, my why. And I've broken it down. That's the picture I've got in front of me. And if I just name them very quickly, it's help, don't sell, always give it your all, professional all times, productivity trumps everything. Your why is to empower 1 million salespeople. That's my why. Listen to learn. Understand you is more important than I. No means not yet. And why is you always ask why. Be inquisitive. So that's my Happy Loony that I've designed. And I remind myself every day of it because that is why I do what I do. And going back to your point, Cole, how do I stay motivated? When I think of that, my sister, my children, my wife, my dad, that's what drives me. So I think Happy Loony encompasses all of that, I guess. And I've got it on my bracelet. I've got Happy Loony there on my bracelet. I've just come back from Italy with my family and I bought this amazing boat picture and I met the artist and she drew Happy Loony on the boat. I haven't got it with me today actually, but it's in my home office, which I'm so excited about. I'm going to keep that forever, you know?
Really, well, thank you for sharing. First of all, obviously a lot in there, and really personal side. So I appreciate you sharing the story and the background behind it. What's interesting to see is how ingrained it is in where you are. There's literally it's
Mm.
literally on your wrist every single day, but you've also now incorporated it into an acronym for what you're looking to do from a sales perspective as well. How important is it? And this is probably more aimed at salespeople, maybe even sales leaders listening to this, going through difficult days. Probably we've all been there in sales. Why am I doing this? How important is it, do you think, for people to have a why that's as strong as yours?
I think it's vital, absolutely vital. And look, a lot of people they'll say, "Well, I want to earn money," right? That is like top of that's surface, right? No one does it because they want a lot of money. Because often I'll say to people, "Okay, so if I could give you triple your salary today, triple your salary to do a job, would you do it?" And often, Carl, they'll say, "What's the job?" So when they say, "What's the job?" immediately money's not their motivator. Otherwise, they wouldn't ask what the job is. They'll just do it, right? So I think the key is if it's money, right, or you believe it's money, why? What are you going to do with that money? What will that money allow you to do for you, your family, your friends, whatever? And once you know that, why are those things important to you? So I think the key is question everything and keep questioning it. And I think if you keep questioning it, you'll come to your real why. And if you're visual like me, create a visual like I do with Happy Loony. Create a visual, put it in front of you. Because when I did this exercise in training with someone, actually, and he was crying at the end of it, his real why is his mother was very poor. That she grew up in poverty. She did 4 jobs to support her son and her 3 daughters. And it's a very good friend of mine, Richard McCann. He's a very, very good friend of mine now, and his story is horrific but wonderful of how he's turned out. And when I think about his mum, Wilma, and I know he won't mind me saying this, his mother was the Yorkshire Ripper's first victim. Those of you that may not have heard of the Yorkshire Ripper, Peter Sutcliffe, he was an infamous serial killer. So Wilma was his first victim. Richard was 5 when his mother died. But if I think back to when I learned about Wilma from Richard and what I've seen on TV, you know, his why is to make his mum proud. She was 5 when she was murdered, right? Literally buying his house. And now he's one of the most successful motivational speakers. He's become, as I said, a very dear friend of mine. I'm very lucky to have met him. And that's his why. And that's so strong. So if you ask him what his why is, he'll say to earn money. That's not his why. He needs to earn money for his life, but his real why is to make his mum proud. He's not even said that to me, but I know that's what it is. So I think it's vital, but it's not easy to find. And I think you've got to really search deep to know what it is and question and question and question. And when you get it, it will change I think will change your life in terms of your real drive as a sales leader, as an entrepreneur, business owner, salesperson. You need to know it, I believe.
Brilliant, inspirational, and quite touching stuff. And I think what you mentioned there about asking why, digging beneath the surface. We train salespeople to be great at doing that with their prospects and their customers.
Yeah,
Actually, doing it internally as well is
correct.
a really good thing to do. Um,
Mm,
Moving on to your coming back to your journey, then obviously initially started sales training business, and we talked about a few of the contracts and even Wales that you won. But in kind of more recent times, a big part of the business has been public speaking as well, and speaking
yeah.
at conferences and sales kickoffs, whatever it may be. How did
Mm.
that happen?
How did that happen? So, um, I guess it was down to training. So, 2006, we set the company up, and I think we heard of a sales exhibition, and it's still around, called the Sales Innovation Show. And I remember, my mentor. I've always had a mentor from day one. And it's something I really recommend to everyone. Is if you don't invest in yourself, why should your customers invest in you? So I've always had mentors, and I remember my mentor saying, if you're going to be a great trainer, you've got to be a good speaker. So you've got to put yourself out there, a bit like a comedian. All comedians started in the back of a pub, right? And made it to what they are, the really successful ones. So he said, you just got to speak. And I wasn't a professional speaker at the time. And what's the difference between an amateur speaker and a professional speaker is professional speaker gets paid to speak. That's the difference. It was something Nigel Risler taught me, one of my mentors, who's a professional speaker. I said, what's the difference? And he chucked me £1. He said, no, he said, stand up and speak for 30 seconds. I did. He gave me £1. He said, now you're a professional speaker. I was like, I love that. So in 2007, I did my first talk at the Sales Innovation Expo. I was very nervous, but I spoke and I basically summarized my training in like 30 minutes. And looking back now, I wasn't a speaker. I was a trainer delivering a talk. Massive difference from a speaker. If I can define the difference, a trainer teaches you how to do it. A speaker speaks about why you need to do it, and they'll drop little things that will be light bulb moments for the audience. Little things, right? And hopefully 3 light bulb moments. So yeah, 2007 I started. I've now done probably 1,000 talks, roughly in 33 countries. And to be honest with you, Carl, I've just started. For me, I look at the best speakers in the world. I can name 3 of them. And when I look at them and I put them on a pedestal, I think I'm an okay speaker when I look at them. But people come up to me and say, Tony, you're the best speaker I've ever listened to. It's nice to hear it, but it's not, I don't believe it when I look at them. And I think that's part of success is you've got to look at them like Lionel Messi, right? Anyone who says they're the best footballer, you look at Lionel Messi and think you're crap if you look at Lionel Messi, right? But even Lionel Messi would have looked at maybe Pele and said, is he the greatest? I don't know. So I think the most successful people never appreciate, they acknowledge it, but they know that your work in progress. Even Lionel Messi at his peak was work in progress.
And who would the top three speakers be, in your opinion?
Jeff Ram, in my opinion, is the best keynote speaker I've ever listened to. He's phenomenal. Geordie, who talks, is a marketing speaker, sublime, 10 out of 10 in everything he does. And Rich and I have spoken about, we both love Ram, and we're Rammers, we call it. And we both agree he's the best speaker in the world, in my experience. Who's the second? Victor Antonio. He's probably the best sales speaker, but in terms of his delivery, he's the best speaker to the point of he does this stance on stage where he crouches down like this, right, holding his hand. And I went up to him afterwards at Outbound and said, why do you do that? And he said, I learned that from Zig Ziglar, who they say is the best salesperson who's ever lived. And he said he studied Zig Ziglar and he modeled himself on Zig Ziglar to the point he copied the stance on stage. And he said it took about 3 hours to perfect it. He looked in the mirror, videoed himself, whatever. So Victor Antonio for delivery. Who would you say is my third best? Probably a guy called Casper Berry, who I learned from about 9 years ago. And Casper became a mentor of mine because he was so good. I reached out and said, "You're amazing, teach me," which he did. And it was his talk about risk, but it was his clever use of PowerPoint, his speed, his slides, his storytelling, and his light bulb moment. I just thought, wow. I listened to every word. I was speechless. So I guess those three are probably my best.
Brilliant. We'll get them noted in the comments for sure, so people can
Yeah,
check
do.
them out. On
Do.
one more thing before we move on to, I guess, your USP when it comes to some of the talks that you've done on stage is
Mm,
just around storytelling, actually, that you've mentioned. Because
yeah.
again, people listening to this will work in sales. Some, I'm sure, might go on to become public speakers. But a
Mm,
lot of the things you've mentioned, such as storytelling, light bulb moments, they're things actually we can take into our day to day when speaking and communicating with customers as well. I think those light
yeah.
bulb moments are really key. Just
Mm,
any actionable tips that you've maybe got for salespeople so they can improve their just storytelling ability in general.
yeah, great question. Probably two or three. So one is I've always learned this in sales that facts tell, stories sell. And the reason for that is people always remember a story. So take the whale as an example. You're never going to forget that now, right? So I could have said the whale's the biggest customer ever land, and you'll go, yeah, great. But I get people come up to me and said, Tony, you don't know me. You trained me 11 years ago. You won't remember me. Trained you 11 years ago. And I still got a picture of a whale in front of me because it's a story that people that can resonate or resonates with people. And it's things they can remember, that metaphor, to get them in the right frame of mind. So I think that's the one thing is, is develop your own stories. That's the first thing. Number two is have what I call a story deck. So think of every sales interaction and where is that in your story deck? So as an example, if you say to me, how did you come up with a whale? I've got a story. Ian McLean was in my story, right? So I've created a story deck. So when I get booked for a speaking gig, I was booked yesterday. I take hours upon hours, probably 40 hours to plan that story, that speech. And I go through my entire deck. I go through the brief. I do loads of things to prepare. I interview clients of the company I'm speaking for. I interview their top salespeople, blah, blah, blah. And once I've got all of that, I create my stories. And then how do I weave them in and out of each other? So I guess the third thing is when you're doing a smart call, you should have a success story. And a success story really comes to two things. Who have you helped like them? The company you're reaching out to, who have you helped like them? And how have you helped them? And what's the biggest problem you solve for them? And if you know those three things about every company you've worked with or are in your company you work for, they're clients of your company. They don't have to be your clients, they have to be the company you work for's clients. They are your success stories. So if, for example, my sales team know if they're phoning Deloitte, the big bank, they know three banks we've worked with, the three problems those banks had, and the results we've helped those banks achieve to overcome that problem. They can talk about them in a story, even though it's my story. They can share it because they work for me. They represent Tony Rush International. So I think they're the three actionable techniques. Story deck, make it your own story, and have a document, which I call my success stories of companies you've helped, what their problem was, and what was the result after you helped them.
Brilliant. Some really actionable tips there. And I'm going to ask a bit of a challenging question on that last point,
Please,
actually, because I
please.
I agree. If you've got success stories to talk about of similar businesses, similar situations they've been in, that's great. But there might be people listening to this that early on in their career, or maybe even
Mm,
working for a startup where they just do not have those customers or success stories yet. So what advice would you maybe give to those people?
yeah. So if you don't have a direct success story, let's say you're reaching out to, I don't know, Facebook and you've never worked with a huge social tech company, never lie. First thing is never lie, right? Sales is not about lying. So what you got to think about is what's the problem Facebook has that you're trying to solve? What, and it might be three, four, five, it will be. Once you've got a list of the problems, think about have you helped any company solve one of those problems? So it doesn't have to be you've worked with a company like Facebook, but you've may work with a startup tech company that had one of the problems that Facebook had on their journey to become the mammoth they are. So that's one way to do it. And I think the other way is everyone you know knows someone you don't. So you might not have the story, but I guarantee someone you know has. And you could say, I interviewed Bob Smith. Bob has helped someone like Facebook. And although I haven't, I spent 10 hours interviewing Bob. And I believe I've now possessed the skills and the knowledge to help you, Mark Zuckerberg, based on my knowledge of my interviews with Bob. And because it's not been my success, but Mark Zuckerberg, Facebook will be my first big success and give me an opportunity to demonstrate that I will solve one of Facebook's biggest problems. That's how I would do it.
Great advice. Because yeah, look, a lot of people or businesses probably do have some great success stories they can share.
Hmm,
Others might not, but focus more on the actual problem that you solved.
correct.
And a similar problem elsewhere, that should certainly be enough. And it feels like we're naturally transitioning into cold calling, which I know we definitely want to touch on before we wrap up today. Coming onto the bridge really between public speaking and cold calling for you is you make live cold calls when doing public speaking gigs.
Hmm.
That, in my opinion, is ready to open up a can of worms and potential embarrassment as well. Because let's face it, there is a lot of rejection in cold calls. So, why do you do it, first of all?
Why do I do it? I think two or three reasons, I guess. One is like you, people are like, wow, I can't believe you do it, right? For me, it's not wow because I've done it. I've probably made 5,000 cold calls, right? So for me, it's not as scary as others feel. Like Lionel Messi doesn't get scared when he takes a penalty, right? He doesn't. So I think that's the first point. Number two, so I want people to realize actually it's not that scary. Because if I'm prepared to do a live call, which I do regularly in front of 1,000 people, if I can do that, then how can they not sit in an office when no one's around and make a call? That's the first point. The second point is I'm happy to get rejected because it's not rejection, it's feedback. Now, obviously, if I make a call and they go, not interested, put phone down, I'm not learning much, right? Although you could argue, actually, I said something in the first 7 seconds that created rejection. So my immediate question to myself is, what can I change to ensure that never happens again? So I'm very open to learn. I don't see it as rejection. I see it as a lesson. I would change the word rejection to lesson. And the more lessons I learn, the better I get at the game. I think that's the second reason I do it. And the third reason is it's great content because when I do it and I get video doing it and people are like, wow, I guess that's my USP. You asked me earlier, Cole, you mentioned the letters USP, and I guess that is my USP, although I would challenge it that I don't like USPs. I call it a UCB. Now, the reason I don't like USPs is our job is not to sell, it's to help and it's to solve problems. But if you break down those three letters, unique selling point, who is that serving? It's not the customer, it's you because you're using it to sell. And no one likes to be sold to. I call it commission breath. No one likes commission breath.
It
So if you
stinks.
look at yeah, it stinks. So if you look at UCB, it's unique client benefit. It's unique. Yep, no one does. No one that I know makes live calls in front of 1,000 people. And how does it benefit the client? Well, they get their sales team to think actually it's not as scary as I think it is, because Tony's doing it in front of 1,000 people. He's obviously loony enough to do it, so that makes sense. And Tony got rejected on stage, which touch wood I haven't yet, but I know I will, in front of 1,000 people. And if he's open to getting rejected in front of 1,000 people, then what excuse have I got? For me, that's UCB.
I think it's interesting because again, a lot of sales trainers, speakers, obviously deliver the theory great content, but I think seeing someone actually practice what they preach as well is a
Mm,
really powerful thing. And
mm,
please share a couple of stories and maybe the best and worst experience, because I'm sure there's loads that have gone well. There must have been some on stage that maybe haven't gone quite as well as you would have liked.
mm. Yeah, and I know them immediately. So the best was, and it was amazing actually. If I say so myself, it really was quite special. I was in Manchester and I was doing a workshop called the Perfect Call. And perfect is an analogy that I use, sorry, an acronym that I use when I do a perfect call. P is preparation, E is empathy, blah, blah, blah. So I was doing this perfect, and I did live calling in front of probably 400 people, and one of them I left a voicemail, but it's a voicemail technique called the ambiguous voicemail. And the voicemail is very simple. It's, hi, Carl, Tony, give me a ring, oh 07. Duh, duh, duh. So I sound like I know you. I don't mention the company. I don't mention the reason I call. I just sound like I know you. I give you mobile. I get a 40% response rate. So I left a voicemail. I'm now back on stage doing my talk, whatever, and the phone rings. Right, it's worked. Pick up the phone, and it's the guy that I left the voicemail for. He said, yeah, Tony, it's Freddie. Who are you? Freddie, thanks for returning my call. And I went into my elevator pitch, did my call. Anyway, cut a long story short, that call turned into an appointment with the logistics director for an £800,000 tender opportunity. It's a company that I called on behalf of Freedom Logistics. That's who I did the call for. I never found out if he won it because I only met this guy once, Freedom Logistics. But what was nice to see, and annoyingly I didn't get it on video, which is so irritating, but that's, I guess, not the point. The point was one phone call live turned into an £800,000 opportunity. I think that's, for me, that's my best success. Where did it go wrong? Luckily, it wasn't on stage, but it was in front of about 30 people. I was training a estate agent called Thomas Morris. I'll never forget. And Simon Bradbury was the director, and I still speak to him today. He's a very good friend of mine. And I did a call, and we were talking on behalf of this guy called Richard. I was phoning to get feedback about Richard. It's a technique I called the fast approach. And anyway, during the call, the guy said, yeah, very pushy. And I said, well, actually, I don't think Richard's pushy. I go, thank you for the feedback. Richard's very passionate. Sometimes it comes across as pushy. And for that, I apologize. And this guy said, Richard's not pushy. You are pushy. So I laughed. I said, look, apologies, but like Richard, I'm also very passionate. So it might sound like I'm being pushy. So the guy sort of lightened up, and luckily I was able to think on my feet, which is one of the traits of, I think, a good salesperson. But, I didn't achieve anything in terms of the outcome. He just said I was pushy. We sort of laughed about it, and about a minute later, the call ended. But I wasn't embarrassed because that's probably the worst that's ever happened to me. And all it was is I got called pushy. Who cares?
Yeah.
In the grand scheme of things, who cares?
There's a lot worse things to be called anyway than pushy.
Oh my
That's
God,
that's for sure.
I've been called a lot worse. Let me tell you.
Coming on to, I guess the final bit then, just around cold calling. You've got another acronym really, or well, a few things that you use when it comes to cold calling, and refer to them more as smart calls as opposed to
Yes.
cold calls. And we hear a lot of different versions. Warm calls are talked about a lot, whatever it may be. But just tell us a little bit around your theory, thinking, and approach to cold calling that you share with others.
So funny enough, Smart Call wasn't my name. I coined it from a guy called Art Subject, who I love. And it was one of the first books, I think the first book I ever read on sales was Spin Selling when I saw software, and it's still very good today. But I think the second book was actually my father-in-law Boyd gave it to me, and it was called Smart Selling by Art Subject. And I loved it, absolutely loved it. Funny enough, Art came on my podcast, Confessions of a Serial Seller. I've interviewed top 100 salespeople in the world, and to me, Art was one of them. And I spoke about that. I use smart selling. He said, Tony, I'm delighted you do. And bless him, he sent me the fourth revised edition signed by Art. I collect signed books by authors. So that was really nice. And what he meant by smart selling is it should never be cold, because if the prospect says, all right, Tony, you've just called me, tell me one thing you know about my company that I don't know. And I'd sit there and go, well, I can't answer that. And then go, then how dare you phone me, interrupt my day, and you're not able to share something that you don't know about my company that I don't know? to me, you're taking the mickey out of me. So I always think about that I need to be so prepared that the person, if he or she turns around and goes, tell me something I don't know, and I'm not able to articulate that, I'm going to lose the opportunity. And that could be the biggest whale that I let slip through the nets. And I never want that to happen. So that's what smart calls are really about, is be ready. And it might take you 10 minutes. It might take you 1 minute, but take that time. So when you do a smart call, I'd rather do 40 smart calls than 140 cold calls.
So it's a really interesting point, and always the debate between volume and scale, but actually
Yes.
quality, and it's a very difficult balance to get. So in your opinion, then, you said about finding out something that they don't know, and these people are likely to be very, very knowledgeable about the place that they work. So again, for salespeople listening to this, how much time should they spend on the preparation, and where do they even look to find out the things they need to find out?
Look, with Google, right? With Google ChatGPT, you're going to find it out now in 1 minute, truth be told. So it's actually not that difficult. I got that, that just came on top of my head, but I learned that from Karen Brady, who's one of the interviewers, right, on The Apprentice. And Karen was, I didn't speak on stage with her, I was listening to her, very good speaker. And she said the first question in every interview she asks is, tell me one thing about my company, West Ham, I don't know. And she said, if the interviewee can't answer it, they're out. That's a tough question, right? But I loved it. So I always, if I'm phoning a company, if I'm prospecting, which I still do, not often, but I probably do 2 prospect calls a week, is not only am I prepared to answer that question, but my team do a mystery call to that company before I make my phone call. So when I phone, I say, Carl, I hope you don't mind, but my team's carried out a mystery call in your business. I've got 7 things that I want to share about the phone call that I've listened to. And if you're okay with it, I'd love to share that on this call today. And most directors are delighted that I've gone out my way to do that bit of homework. It's not a lot. And they're delighted that I've, taken that time out. And more importantly, I can share value from. They love that. So I guess to answer your question is, it should take you 5 minutes maximum with LinkedIn, Google, and ChatGPT. Most salespeople are lazy. They'd rather pick up the phone and do 3 cold calls in 5 minutes than 1 smart call in 5 minutes. And I know what's going to get a better outcome. So I think it's all about going back to your why, your goals, your objectives. And if they are really your why, do 40 smart calls, not 140 cold calls.
Good advice. And one final piece on cold calls, something you shared prior to this podcast, was just around the approach itself. I thought was quite
Yeah,
interesting in the word and the acronym GAP. So just again,
yeah,
just share your kind of approach and thinking behind this.
yeah. So that it was Richard Denny. He passed away about 7 years ago, and he used to do a daily Denny tip, which I loved. And the best tip I ever got from him was, if you don't have a goal, you can't score. I love that. And often when I'm coaching salespeople, I say, they're about to pick up the phone. I say, look, just before you dial the number, what's your goal? And they say, oh, I just want to get hold of her. Okay. And when you get hold of her, what's your goal? And they haven't really got an answer. So the first thing is, your primary goal is, what's the number one outcome you want? Have a secondary goal as well, because you're very likely to get the secondary goal during the day. So you stay motivated. The secondary goal could be get someone's mobile. It could be find out alternative contact, whatever. Your A is your approach, and every call often has a different approach. So your approach could be, if your primary goal is to find out the key stakeholders, your approach could be go on LinkedIn, go on their website, get some names, and bring that up in the conversation. Say, look, I've seen Peter Jackson is your COO. I don't believe Peter's going to be the right person. Who does Peter work alongside? And now I get a name. That would be my approach. So have a clear approach based on the goal you want. And as I said, if your primary goal is to get an appointment, the approach I use, that I coach, is don't talk about what you do, talk about what you've done successfully with companies or people like them. And you've got a name drop, and you've got to have a success story. And then the P, in terms of preparation, goes back to the point we've been talking about. Have you been on the website? Have you read a blog they've written? Have you watched a video that's on their website? Have you got some insights that you can talk about to demonstrate you've prepared for this call? Because if you haven't, they're going to lose respect for you, and you haven't credibility, or you haven't earned the right to call them.
Brilliant stuff, Tony. And kind of final question before we wrap up then. As you know, the whole reason behind this podcast is to change the perception of sales. We want more people proactively choosing to go into it, or those that are maybe struggling to wanting to stay within the industry. So for anyone listening, why should they go into sales as a career, in your opinion?
I think sales is a very respectable role, a very respectable job, a very respectable career. However, most people thinking about going to sales, especially in the UK, see it as a negative. And I think the negative connotation, and it's wrong, but a perception might be car salespeople are a poor salesperson, or people selling double glazing door to door. But actually, if I look at, I know two people, one selling cars and one selling double glazing, and they're both exceptional salespeople. So when people talk about sales, go, oh, it's cheesy, it's pushy. All these negative connotations are based on their wrong beliefs, in my opinion, or experiences they've had themselves or people they know. So I think change your perception, base it on top salespeople, not the worst salespeople. That's the first thing. The second thing, in America, sales actually very respected, because for me, if you're really good at selling, you're solving problems, and you're not selling, you're helping. And the more people you can help, the more people you can serve, the more money you're going to generate. Some of the salespeople that I've coached earn £1 million a year, which I know sounds like that's impossible, but it's not. I can tell you it's not impossible, because they do it. And they don't see themselves as salespeople. They really don't. And if I ask them what's their job, they'd say I'm a problem solver. And what's interesting, Cole, to wrap this up, is I was in Miami 3 weeks ago working with a media company called Inc Global, great company, and their top sales guy called DB, earns a lot of money. And the person that reached out to me the most to get my advice out of 18 salespeople I coached was DB. He was their top salesperson, earning a serious amount of money. And not only did he take me out for breakfast to pick my brains, he's phoned me recently to book me for one-on-one coaching. And that's a big investment, but he wants to book me in October for one-on-one. And bear in mind, this is the top salesperson in the company for the last 4 consecutive years. What does that tell you about people that are exceptional sellers? Is they are work in progress. They keep on getting better. And Art Subject, the creator of Smart Calling, said to me, no one graduates from the School of Selling. And I love that.
What a great message and way to finish the episode. Tony, thank you very much for joining us. Really enjoyed the conversation. Thank
My
you again.
pleasure. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.